Thanks to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to interact with you today. I can only concur with Martin Cave's comments about the quality of the atmosphere and environment in which this interesting conference is taking place. As you can see, the title of my intervention will be Vertical Integration and Foreclosure. So, I will be focusing on the dark side of vertical mergers. As a preamble, let me stress that this is not meant to imply that this is the only or even the main side to this. There is obviously also a bright side, sometimes a very bright side. I will just try to make sure that this brightness will not make us blind to the other darker shadows that may be surrounding vertical mergers. I will organize my remarks starting with the so-called conventional wisdom, or sometimes referred to as the pre-Chicago era. Then briefly outline the Chicago critique about this conventional wisdom, and then focus on the more recent contributions, advances that have highlighted some specific sets of circumstances in which vertical mergers may trigger some competition concerns. Let's start with the so-called conventional wisdom, which is sometimes referred to as the good old monopoly leverage theory of harm. In the context, as Dennis mentioned, the same qualitative analysis can be applied to both vertical or non-horizontal conglomerate mergers of complementary goods or services. I will be focusing or casting the comments in the context of vertical mergers, but you could transpose this to the case of non-vertical mergers of complementary goods and services, like an operating system and application software. Let's suppose that you have an upstream bottleneck, so you have a monopolistic supplier. It may control either some kind of essential facility, some infrastructure, or some essential input, or maybe some essential patent, and so forth. And this input or infrastructure is necessary for downstream competitors to be active in this downstream market. So potentially you can have competition in the downstream market, but you have to rely on this bottleneck upstream. The concern here is that the bottleneck may distort competition in the downstream segment in order to leverage its market power from the upstream segment to the downstream segment. And in this way, gain market power in an additional market, and therefore capture additional profits in this way. The practices that in question can, and this will echo Dennis' remarks on the alternative ways of achieving the same fulfilling the same purpose. You can be a vertical merger, vertical integration, associated with refusal to deal with downstream rivals, or constructive refusals, prohibitive wholesale prices, or more generally wholesale conditions that are really unfavorable to downstream rivals, can engage various forms of tie-ins and so forth. Alternatively, you can have contractual solutions that achieve the same end. You can have exclusive dealing, or you can engage in price discrimination, so you may favor one downstream firm at the detriment of its downstream rivals. Now, the so-called Chicago critique makes the very basic point that in this industry, there is a single source of profit. There is a demand from the final users, and if you control one of the stages of the production and distribution that eventually serves this demand, controlling one of the stages is good enough to reap, to enjoy market power and reap the profits that can be generated by serving this demand. So, in other words, you don't need to have monopoly power at each and every stage. Having monopoly power or significant, substantial market power at one stage is good enough enough to reap the associated profit. Going further, actually, if there is competition at some of the stages, and if this competition yields better services or less costly goods or services at that stage, then it may enhance the overall value of the vertical chain, and by controlling one of those stages, you will be able to reap even greater profits. So, if you are in this position, you should encourage actually competition at the other stages in order to enhance the overall value and reap greater profits. Therefore, the logical implication is that if you see some practices that look strange, they must be there for good efficiency reasons. They cannot be there to, for bad anti-competitive purpose. So that's, and there are many examples of potential efficiencies, double marginalization, marginally aligning the interests of the upstream and downstream partners. There can be a good reason for engaging in vertical integration or associated or related practices. Now, there as well, I can only concur with Chris' remarks. You have to ask the question, what would be the alternative solutions, contractual solutions to reap those efficiencies? So I think it's fair to have a balanced approach and keeping in mind the alternative solutions for both the anti-competitive but also for the possible efficiency motivations. Now, this post-Chicago, if I may, there has been some recent work. I mean, the Chicago critique has triggered some more work. Economists went back to the working table and tried to take this well-founded critique on board. And this has led to a body of work that has identified those more specific sets of circumstances in which there may be a problem associated with vertical mergers, and circumstances in which vertical mergers may trigger competition concerns. One of those body of literature, starting with the works of Oliver Hart and Jean Tirole in Brookings, 1990, or Dan O'Brien and Greg Schaeffer in the RAND, 1992, or McAfee and Schwartz in the AER, 94, have focused on the fact that contracts may not be may not work may not allow the parties to achieve perfect coordination when there is a scope for opportunistic behavior by the parties. In particular, this, for example, this could be the case when you have secret negotiations between the upstream bottleneck and the various downstream competitors. So when the bottleneck is negotiating with one of the downstream competitors, it may have an incentive to basically to free ride on the downstream rivals. In the same way, if you wish, that if I have to decide as a franchisor, if I have to decide how many franchisees I will have in a given town, I would have an incentive to convince the first prospective franchisee that he will be the only one in town, so that the franchisee will be willing to pay a lot to obtain this privilege. But of course, once I've done this, I will be quite happy to issue, to have a second license, a second franchisee around. There will be some residual demand for having a second franchisee, so I can make a profitable deal with an additional franchisee at the expense, of course, of the first initial franchisee. Of course, the first franchisee, anticipating this risk of opportunistic behavior, will not be willing to pay that much for the first franchise. And therefore, this risk of opportunistic behavior backfires and actually prevents the franchisee, in this example, prevents the franchisee from exploiting fully its market power. This is the same idea that was transposed by Hart, Tirole, Brian Schaeffer, and McAfee, Schwartz, and others in the context of multiple bilateral secret negotiations between one bottleneck and several competing downstream rivals. So this not being able of fully exploiting this market power, of course, gives a motivation for finding solutions. So if contracts do not work, then vertical integration may be an alternative. And indeed, Hart and Tirol and the others have shown that vertical integration may provide a good solution to this risk of opportunistic behavior. The idea being that once the bottleneck, the upstream bottleneck, is vertically integrated with one of the downstream rivals, it no longer has an incentive to basically shoot itself in the foot. So because free riding, it doesn't have an incentive on free riding on itself, in a sense. So that eliminates the risk of opportunistic behavior, that restores the upstream bottleneck ability of exploiting its market power, of course at the expense of downstream users who will face higher prices as a result. So that's one post-Chicago example of reasoning argument that captures the idea that in some circumstances, typically the situations where this risk of opportunistic behavior is serious and contractual solutions are not sufficiently effective to curb this risk of opportunistic behavior, then in those circumstances, you may be concerned that vertical integration may lead to higher prices and reduce and harm consumers. Building on this, in recent work with Volker Nokia, we have extended this analysis to the case of oligopolistic competition downstream. The original work was really focusing on the case of a pure bottleneck, if you wish, and with Volker we are showing that the same logic carries over to situations where you have imperfect competition upstream. So if you have not one pure monopolies, but let's say, a duopoly, the same issue arises. What we have shown is that in a situation where you have, let's say, two sources of input, two brands of input, brand A and brand B at the upstream level, and then you have a competitive or potentially competitive downstream segment. Then in the absence of vertical integration, and if you throw in this opportunistic behavior, bilateral secret negotiations between each of the suppliers A and B and each of the downstream competitors, 1 and 2 in this little figure here, if you have a really competitive outcome, which in a sense is as if you had the two firms downstream being able to provide at cost both brands A and B. So you have a strong competition, vivid competition. If instead one of the supplier vertically integrates with one of the downstream competitors, so in this example, if supplier A vertically integrates with the first competitor, then we show that it will have an incentive in order to better exploit its market power. It will have an incentive to stop supplying the downstream competitor, i.e. The brand A will become available only at competitor 1. So you have less competition as a result. At least you have less competition for brand A, and indirectly, as a result, you have less competition overall in the industry. In this context, if you have a second vertical integration, this time with the other supplier B and the remaining downstream competitor 2 in this example, then as a result, supplier B will also have an incentive to stop supplying the downstream rival. So it will stop supplying competitor 1, and therefore, as a result, you will have a situation where if you want brand A, you have to go to competitor 1. If you want brand B, you have to go to competitor 2, and as a result, there is even less competition in the industry. So that extends, if you wish, the insights of this first body of literature to the case of oligopolistic competition upstream. So this is a situation where because contracts did not allow the parties to achieve appropriate coordination between the upstream and the downstream because of this risk of opportunistic behavior, then vertical integration allows the parties to better exploit their market power at the expense of consumers. Now, what are the policy implications of this? It depends. This is an analysis which is very static in a sense. It just says that vertical integration may allow the firms to better exploit whatever market power they have. So the question really is, what is the origin of this market power? If this market power is the result of innovation, it may be a good idea to let innovators appropriate the benefits of their innovation, because from a longer term perspective, this may well contribute to encourage further investment in R&D, innovation, and whatnot. So in that case, it's not the fact that the story I've just outlined does not necessarily lead to the conclusion that you should strongly intervene. By contrast, and this is the case in many industries in Europe, it may be less the case on the other side of the pond, but in Europe there are many industries where you have bottlenecks which are a bit the result of past history, economies of scale. It has nothing to do with innovation, but economies of scale plus historical legacies. In this kind of situation, obviously, there is less of a reason for letting the incumbents, historical incumbents, exploiting the market power which they simply inherited. And therefore, in that case, this line of reasoning may call for more active intervention. How much time? So my last remarks will be focusing on a different type of work, which was triggered by the two mergers mentioned by Per in the GPS industry, the digital map industry. This comes from this work was prompted by concerns which echo one of the remarks by Dennis, i.e. the fact that firms are sometimes very reluctant to share sensitive information. Here Dennis mentioned the example of sharing databases. You may be concerned that if you share those databases, then some information may be passed on that you rather keep for yourself. More generally speaking, firms often exchange information with either suppliers or customers, and this raises the concern that this information may be then passed on to rivals or may be exploited in some way. In such a context, vertical integration, vertical merger may again have a bright side and dark side. On the bright side, vertical integration may ensure that the parties will protect the sensitive information internally. The dark side may be that downstream rivals or upstream rivals of those vertically integrated firms may be concerned that relying on the integrated supplier or relying on the integrated downstream distributor, let's say, may exacerbate the risk of exploitation and leakage of sensitive information. In the context of, so we have been working on this with two co-authors, Marie-Laure Alain and Claire Chambol. This was prompted, as I mentioned initially, by the mergers between Atlas and Tom-Tele on the one hand, and Navteq and Nokia on the other hand. So what we are talking about, if you go to Google, if you use Google Maps, and until recently, at the bottom of the screen on Google Maps, you would see I think it's Navteq or Atlas, one of the two. You will see one of the two suppliers, one of the two firms that are on the screen at the upstream stage. All the service providers rely essentially on two sources of content for those services. The content in question is the navigable digital map databases. So in other words, you need people, you need companies that collect information. They will collect pictures from a satellite, pictures from planes, pictures taken by those minivans that you see sometimes in the streets. They will collect information about public administrations and so on. Put this all together in a digital map database, and this is what you need in order to provide the services. At the downstream level, at that time, there were 3 segments. You had those handheld devices. Tom-Tele was the leading manufacturers of those handheld devices that provide GPS features. Garmin was a contender, and so on. You had some in-dash, in cars, you had some integrated GPS devices. And then the emerging features at that time was the GPS features in smartphones. So Nokia at that time was one of the leading manufacturers of high-end smartphones. So within 2 weeks, and at the upstream level, there were only 2 at that time, providers of content. Within 2 weeks, one of the 2 providers was merging with the leading manufacturers of handheld devices, Tom-Tele. So Teleatlas was merging with, it was announced that Teleatlas was going to merge with Tom-Tele. And the other content provider, Navteq, was announced to merge with one of the leading manufacturers of smartphones, again, at that time, namely Nokia. And one of the, so this triggered a very intensive investigation on both sides of the Atlantic. Per mentioned that as far as the Commission is concerned, there was a very detailed work that was done looking at the kind of foreclosure concerns that I was mentioning before. On the one hand, the risk was that the content provider, the integrated content provider, would stop supplying its digital map database to downstream rivals, or would not necessarily give access to the most recently updated version of the content. That was one of the concerns, and therefore the risk, the analysis was focusing on what would be the gain for the downstream rival, what would be the loss to the upstream suppliers in terms of lost sales to the downstream competitors. So there was a very detailed work that was done, and based on structural econometric estimations and so on. That was very well done. One concern I will be focusing, which was a bit different, was the concern expressed as some of the downstream competitors. The concern was as follows. For example, Garmin stated this kind of concern. The name of the game in this industry is to come up with a new cool feature, and once you and this involves 2 steps. First, you have to come up with an idea about a new cool feature, and then once you have this bright idea, you have to go to your content provider and explain a bit what the idea is about, so as to adapt the content and make and implement the idea. And the concern from Garmin was, now if Teleatlas is vertically integrated with my direct competitor, namely Tom-Tele, am I going to go to Teleatlas and say, I have this bright idea about a new cool feature? This is going to be a killer. That was the concern. The concern would be that then the idea would be passed on to the downstream subsidiary, the direct competitor of Garmin. And this, I think this is a situation that has echoes in other industries as well. And in the paper with Marie-Laure and Claire, what we show is that vertical integration indeed drastically affects the incentives of the integrated supplier in this example, the incentive of protecting or exploiting the information of its downstream customers. An independent supplier has all the incentives in the world to build a reputation of being good at protecting its customers' information, because that's its line of business is is there. An integrated supplier, by contrast, has actually the incentive to develop a reputation of being bad. In this way, this will put the downstream competitors at the mercy of the remaining providers that basically raise rivals' costs, and therefore, in this way, that will benefit the integrated downstream rival. I remember presenting this paper a couple of years ago in Chicago at the Learconference, and Joe Farrell, who was the chief economist at the FTC at this time, remained silent during the presentation. But 4 days later, I received an email with pointing to the link to a decision of the judgment of, is it a decision or judgment, I don't remember, of the FTC in a vertical merger between the Coca-Cola company and the bottlers that had just been adopted by the FTC. And also, obviously, could not talk about this during the conference, but got the news after being back in Toulouse. So I think that this is a kind of concerns that may arise in other industries. Here it was framed in terms of input foreclosure. You can cast it as well in terms of customer foreclosures. Manufacturers of branded products have expressed concerns, for example, that now that their distributors, large retail chains, have started or are routinely distributing their own private labels as well, they have expressed the concern that when they want to launch a new product, they have 6 months before the launch, they have to go to their retailers and explain, start negotiating, organizing the launch, and guess what? Once the new product reaches the shelves, next to it there is a Me Too private label that looks very similar to the new product. So you have the same kind of concerns as well in terms of customer foreclosure, not only in terms of input foreclosure. Now, one of the policy implications for this is that when remedies exist, so such as firewalls or commitments to protect the sensitive information, then those commitments should be part of the merger procedures, because even if those remedies exist, the firms may lack the incentive to adopt those remedies post-merger. So the competition agencies or the merger control office should pay attention to this and make sure that those remedies are on the table when the parties submit the proposal for a merger. So that I guess would be the main policy implication for this. Thank you.